Cuba comes off the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Did they deserve to? And what does the U.S. get in return? 36 lawyers from South Florida spent 4 days in Cuba studying their legal system. Does it provide protections for U.S. investors? On a visit to Miami, the president makes a surprise visit to a sacred shrine for Cuban exiles. What did that visit mean? We will take it to the roundtable. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. Lena is off today. Well, there was a flurry of activity late this week as the U.S. and Cuba made a major move toward normalizing relations. The Obama administration took Cuba off the list of countries that sponsor terrorism. No question, Cuba used to do that back in the 1970s and 80s, but have they really stopped? If they have, then what are all those Cuban intelligence agents doing in Venezuela? And what about the freighter that was stopped in Panama bound for North Korea with hidden Cuban weapons and MiG jets on board in violation of several treaties? That is the context in which 38 lawyers from Miami-Dade and Broward visited Cuba this week. They are part of the international law section of the Florida Bar. In Havana, they met with Cuban abogados and maybe abogadas to learn how the Cuban legal system works. The Florida lawyers will use their knowledge they gained to advise a host of corporate clients who are chafing to do business on the island. Peter Quinter led the South Florida delegation. He is the chair of the International Bar section of the Florida Bar and a shareholder at Gray Robinson in Fort Lauderdale. Jennifer Olmedo Rodriguez is an attorney in Miami, a shareholder in the Buchanan, Ingersoll and Rooney firm. She was on that 4-day trip to Havana, as was James Meyer, a partner with the Harper Meyer, Perez, Hagan, O'Connor, Albert, and Driven firm in Miami. Good morning to you all. Great to have you come in.
Good morning, Michael.
All right, Peter, as the leader of this group, give us your overall assessment of Cuba's legal system, and if you had to advise a client today about the advisability of investing in Cuba, what would you say?
My overall impression upon my first visit to Cuba was how welcoming the Cubans were for Americans. We talked to everybody from the taxi driver to the clerk to a store manager, and freedom that they had to speak with us was surprising to me. I thought this would be the 1960s, 1970s time period where there was somebody following me. It was not like that at all.
Yeah.
The second most impressive thing that struck me as soon as I got there was the physical decay of the city of Havana. There have been virtually no new construction of any kind of buildings since 1959.
Yeah, they have gone into Old Havana, and I'm sure that you all saw that, and they've done some nice restoration work in by the cathedral and down by that plaza. But Jennifer, you were also struck by the fact that if you drive along the Malecon there, the great drive that fronts the bay, that in fact a lot of those buildings are just falling down.
They're literally collapsing, Michael. That's absolutely true. It is just such a shame to see these beautiful buildings. The architecture was just simply stunning. The amount of detail that is in those buildings, and to just see them literally decaying was very sad, very, very hard to watch.
Yeah. And Jim Meyer, let me ask you, you met with a number of Cuban lawyers, I know. In fact, in the Daily Business Review, Julie Kay was there, and she talked, did a story about meeting with somebody named Osvaldo Miranda Diaz, who was a lawyer there. And according to Julie's story, you know, she wrote that Mr. Miranda told you, quote, "The legal system of Cuba is disgusting. There is no due process."
I think what Julie was trying to convey, and perhaps it became a little bit more, the word disgusting was maybe a little bit more inflammatory in print than it was in the actual presentation. What Osvaldo was saying to us is he was trying to give us a very frank and open discussion of the system and the pros and the cons of it. Yeah. Now, and in that exchange back and forth, a very informal, pleasant exchange where it became a little bit maybe too comfortable. Maybe certain words were used, but the truth of the matter was he was trying to give us a really open picture of the system. Yeah. The truth of the matter is that the system has as we know, the legal system, there is no independent judiciary. There is, the judiciary is governed by the legislature. The legislature, of course, has the influence from the executives, which we understand the problems there.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, if you read this morning's Miami Herald, Andre Oppenheimer had a very excellent column this morning. I'm going to put a quote up. People at home can read this. If I can see this, 2020. Cuba lacks an independent judiciary to protect investors' rights, as so many Spanish and Canadian business people have learned the hard way, and that is not likely to change anytime soon. Jennifer, would you say Andres is right, or?
I think from our discussions and the lectures that we had during our time in Cuba, it was explained to us in a way where it was describing Cuba as an emerging market. And there are certain inherent risks in investing in Cuba because it's an inherent market, it's an emerging market. And those risks are present that in countries today where investors are heavily involved. They equated it to China, to Vietnam, and there are risks. There are certainly risks, but there are the potential for very high rewards. And so each company needs to make that decision on a case-by-case basis.
We were also told that those examples that you demonstrated were the exception, not the rule.
Well, what about the story, and maybe you aren't familiar with the particulars, and I'm not familiar with the particulars, but Peter, there was a Canadian investor who went down there, spent, I don't know, millions of dollars, wound up in prison. Don't know if he's still in a prison down there. And then there were the two British citizens who invested in the hotel, and it was supposed to be a joint, everything's a joint venture with the Castro government. And they spent 2 years in prison, and then they were expelled.
Well, they were accused of corruption, and of course the accusation of the system and the Cuban government is that maybe they were too successful, and then they were accused of corruption and sedition against the government. I think that the answer that we received from when we talked to independent lawyers and lawyers that were officially part of the system and of the bufetes and the colectivas. Their answer to us was that investors, when they come in, number one, they need to maintain low profiles. Don't show off your wealth to the Cuban people. We're not going to like that. Number two, you have to when you're investing in Cuba, you have to understand the government's giving you essentially a monopoly because they're not opening up 10 bottle factories. They're only opening one. So in exchange for the monopoly that the government's letting you participate in at the level of 49%. What we're going to have to accept a much higher level of risk. That's really the only argument that they're going to give you.
Yeah, I mean, but again, Peter, foreign business, and they're being courted by the Cuban government, and I know the National Assembly there passed some new laws to try to make investing more appealing. But, you know, to an American businessman or woman who says, I want to open or do business in Cuba, I don't want a joint venture, and I don't want to be a 49% partner with the Cuban government.
The answer is wait. You know, I was struck by a couple of different things, as I said. First of all, the welcoming nature of not just the Cuban people, but the government attitude seems to be that they welcome U.S. investment. Yes, it'll be a 51-49% split, although there is a new law that allows for private businesses. For example, we had dined at a few restaurants which were new, which wouldn't have existed a year or two ago.
Are they state-run restaurants?
No, not at all.
By private individuals?
And the best part about those restaurants, the actual Cubans were actually eating in the restaurants for the first time. And every visit I've had before this, there were only the foreigners. This time we were eating with Cubans in Cuban restaurants for the first time.
I was particularly struck by the entrepreneurial spirit that I saw in talking to people walking down the street. People are fixing up their old classic American cars in order to offer them as taxis for tourists. They're opening up restaurants in their family homes that they've held for generations after renovating them.
Casa particular.
Exactly, exactly. And they're privately run businesses. We asked them at length as to whether or not they were taxed extensively by the government, what the requirements were for them to open their businesses.
What are the taxes on these businesses?
They didn't give us specifics in terms of numbers. They said that they did have to pay a tax, but our understanding from discussions with the actual owners of the paladares that we ate at was that it was a very profitable business for them as private
Right.
citizens.
And for foreign investment, of course, the new law, there's no tax. They have a tax holiday for a decade. So for foreign investment, one thing we should say though, we're U.S. lawyers. There is really no significant investment from the United States. It's illegal for virtually all areas that are significant.
But you all, I mean, the reason we're having this talk is that you, I think, represent the legal vanguard that is looking at this situation because, I mean, let's face it, Hyatt and Marriott and Hilton and agricultural manufacturers, I mean, a whole range of businesses want to get in there. I mean, 11 million people are down there. They don't have a lot of money, but
11 million people, 2 million mobile phones so far, 600,000 cars with 300,000 owned by the government.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great opportunities there.
And 5% internet penetration
only
in this country. I mean, telecommunications is going to be a huge thing.
The laws are going to have to change in Cuba and in the United States for us to be able to do that.
They do. You know, Jennifer, maybe the most basic question, and I should have asked it earlier, is if a businessman or woman goes in there and there is a dispute, are contracts enforceable?
That's a complicated question. What we were told, currently, the system is such that the possibility of recovering against the Cuban government is not very likely at this time. There was a lot of debate during our lectures about that. As American lawyers, we had a very difficult time understanding that concept and understanding how we would advise our clients on that. But at the end of the day, the way that it was described to us and explained was just a risk-benefit analysis.
Well, we also, I should add that there was a significant discussion, of course, among lawyers of the law. And what we ended up concluding was not to litigate in the courts of Cuba, but to have an arbitration clause, an international arbitration clause, and arbitrate somewhere outside of Cuba.
All right, well, that's interesting. Hold your thoughts. We're going to come back, talk more with our lawyers who have just come back last night, in fact, from Havana. Stay with us. Glad you're with us on this Sunday morning. Live in our studio are three attorneys from South Florida who just have returned from Havana last night after a 4-day trip. Peter Quinter with Gray Robinson, Jennifer Olmedo Rodriguez with Buchanan Ingersoll, and James Meyer with the Harper Law Firm. Jennifer, one of the things that wasn't announced about your itinerary was a meeting with some dissidents. And I think it's great that you did. Who did you meet with?
Our group, actually, the group that I was with, didn't particularly meet with the dissident. I know there was a change in the itinerary, so I'm going to change
what we did
Peter.
is we had scheduled meetings with some dissidents. We did not include it on the official itinerary that was prepared by the travel agent for obvious reasons. Jim participated directly with the two people.
Yeah, tell us, Jim, who did you meet with?
We met with Mr. Rene Gomez Manzano. He was one of the original group of four who drafted the paper that the fatherland is for us all, and he was in prison on 3 occasions, and one of those occasions in 1997, while he was in prison, he received the award from the American Bar Association for human rights. He now acts as a lawyer for the dissidents, for Yoyani Sanchez and the other dissidents, representing them unofficially because he's not allowed to practice law, but he's not part of any organization that is permitted to appear in court.
Was his message to you, welcome, we're glad you're here, we think together maybe we can change some things for the better?
His position was that the evolution is not going to occur from within. His position was he hopes that the younger generation, that'll take a lot of time, over the course of many years, the younger generation will indeed could change it from within, but at this point in time, the system is self-perpetuating and it can't be changed.
Yeah, and one of the other people, Peter, you told me when you arrived this morning that you met with is the historian of Havana, Eusebio Leal. Is that his name?
Was not on the official itinerary because we wanted to keep it simply between myself and Jim until we returned to the United States to avoid any potential problems. So Jim, I'd like you to talk about
Yeah,
what you
absolutely. I'd be glad to. And again, we had two different licenses we traveled under. And on December 17th, our government gave us some new general licenses which would allow us to travel to Cuba.
12 categories.
12 categories. Under those 12 categories, you can travel as a tour group with a full-time agenda and then on a people-to-people exchange, meeting the people of Cuba. But there's another category which is professional meetings. And so we took down two different groups, a smaller group which would be professional meetings. And in those professional meetings, that's where we had these more delicate, sensitive meetings with government officials such as Eusebio Leal and Dr. Rene Gomez and so on. And a number of law firms. Actually, we actually met with private law firms, the bufetes and the colectivas, and we met with independent lawyers who aren't affiliated with law firms, which was fascinating. With regard to Dr. Leal, a wonderful man, very impressive. He definitely has a vision for Cuba that I think I can see why he does so well in the international arena, and I do think
they
he's
gave him a lot
success.
of latitude
Yeah.
talking to foreign visitors. Not to make this too personal, Jennifer, but you're proud of your Cuban-American heritage. Your mother, father fled, what, 50 years ago, you said, 45 years
Just about.
ago? Yeah.
Yes.
And how did they feel about you going to Havana and being part of an effort to at least see how you can bridge the differences?
It was very difficult for me to make the decision when the opportunity presented itself, because I knew the way that my family felt about this and how personal it was for them, particularly for my grandfather and everything that he went through in his position that Cuba needed to be free from the existing regime. My parents at first were very shocked. I don't think they expected me to come to them and tell them I'm leaving to Havana in 6 weeks. But when I explained to them what I was doing, this is my opportunity to take a part in change and bringing about change and seeing to the realization of everything that they have been fighting for and everything that my grandfather fought for his entire life until he passed away. So they were very supportive of it, but it was a very emotional trip.
Yeah, and when you went to, you said I believe your father's boyhood home or his native home?
I did. I had the incredible opportunity to go meet the gentleman who's living in the house where my father and my uncle were born. I had the opportunity to tour the house. I was able to stand in the living room where my father as a little boy lived.
That's a moment. That's quite a moment, isn't it?
It was a very bittersweet trip for me, very mixed emotions.
Yeah.
About half the group were Cuban Americans. And two families brought, the husband and wife lawyers, brought their children, daughters and sons, to go back, as Jennifer did, to the places where they grew up or their parents lived or worked. And it was emotional for a lot of people. We were able to experience that.
And Jim, in fact, your in-laws are Cuban American.
Yes, they are. As a matter of fact, and they gave me the gift of the Cuban culture. So I at one point on a prior trip visited my father-in-law's hometown, and my mother-in-law she still has family there. So my father-in-law joked with me, of course, just don't tell anybody that you're related to me, okay? But my mother-in-law, it's her birthday today, and I'm bringing her gifts from Cuba.
Wow.
So
Feliz cumpleaños.
Yeah.
Well, you also, Peter, learned some things which we have not heard about a timetable for normalizing relations, and tell us what you learned.
Well, through government and non-government officials, through the media there, we learned unofficially that there'll be an announcement by the Obama administration along with the Castro administration before July 4th to normalize relations, diplomatic relations between the two countries. I expect after that a set of new regulations from the United States and Cuba to be promulgated sometime later this year, allowing for greater commercial relationships.
Of course, the Helms-Burton Act remains on the books in this country, and that really regulates how much commercial relationship. I don't know how much through executive order or through other regulations from OFAC that can change. I mean, how much can change?
I think it's going to be a slow process, and it's going to be something that's going to have to take, we're going to have to take step by step and just see as things evolve.
I think the executive branch has gone about as far as it can. I think now it's up to Congress, but I think it's also up to the Cuban government. The laws in Cuba have to change probably as much, if not more so, than our laws.
Yeah, well, I would remind you and our viewers that in Panama or in Costa Rica a couple of months ago, Raul Castro gave a speech in which he said, okay, we're going to have new relationships with the United States, but nothing nothing in Cuba is going to change. Maybe that was for public consumption. Who knows what's going to happen behind the scenes, but there have been no indications from the top of the Cuban government things are going to change.
From what we've seen, things are already changing. And as the leaders of the Florida Bar's International Law Section, I think it's our obligation to hasten that change that in this historic opportunity that we have.
Well, that
even if some people consider it unpopular.
All right. Well, unpopular is sometimes a good thing. Anyway, Peter, thank you very much for coming in. Jennifer and Jim, we appreciate. I mean, you just got off the plane last night, but this is all fresh stuff, so thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, up next we are taking Cuba and other topics at the roundtable, so stay with us. All right, time now to take a closer, more analytical look at the top stories in the news this week, and boy, have we got a group to do it. Professor Andy Gomez is a retired senior fellow at the University of Miami Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies, also a former vice provost at the school. Ed Pizzoli is a prominent Fort Lauderdale attorney, president of the Tripp Scott Law Firm, and an active player in state Republican Party politics. Marlon Hill is a familiar face. He's an attorney and partner in the Hamilton, Miller, and Berthasell firm, and a member of several civic and charitable boards, also a radio host. To all of you, good morning. Great to have you come in. Appreciate it.
Good to see you.
All right, so my friend Andy Gomez, tell us this trip that these 38 lawyers took to Cuba to look at the advisory, to be able to advise their clients about the prospects of doing business there. Did we hear enough about the risks of going in and investing in Cuba?
First and foremost, I applaud their efforts. More than that, meeting with dissidents. I mean, I applaud that effort, meeting with dissidents in Cuba. Michael, I still see, as I've told you before, the risks are greater than the opportunities. Meeting with Eusebio Leal, who is the historian of Cuba, is not, the Cuban government did not give him access to a member of the military, a member of the Grupo Gaesa that controls the economy.
Or Alimport or one of the other.
So that's very indicative to me. As I've said before, the Cuban government is going to select, with all this euphoria that is going on here in the States and in South Florida, they're going to select who is going to invest in Cuba. And it's not necessarily from South Florida, the United States.
Well, it can be, we've already got Canadian investors, Spanish, Italian.
Absolutely.
The Italians run the phone system. I mean, there are investors from all over the world, and yet, Ed, as we all know, their economy is just a mess.
Well, there are no rules. There's no rule of law.
Right.
There's no true government structure. You essentially have the Castro brothers and the military regime controlling the economy top down. And so before that significantly changes, and we're looking for a moment in time, I think we can do all we can do to prepare in South Florida and the United States, but at the end of the day, the Castro brothers can't be there in order for significant change to occur.
Yeah, but you know, Marlon, you are a student of the presidency and of President Obama, and he wants his legacy, part of his legacy, to be just as China opened, Nixon opened China, he wants to be the president who opened relations with Cuba, and apparently he's willing to overlook, you know, the lack of human rights changes or basic human freedoms.
I don't think he's overlooking those human rights and basic freedoms. And it's really not more about a legacy. It's really about his style and approach to diplomacy and foreign affairs. This is his, you know, he likes to engage our opponents, our enemies, persons who think differently with regards to our policies. I really believe that we really need to kind of take a step back, take a breath. You know, cambio and change is going to take a long, long while for things to change in Cuba. Right. Cuba is a Caribbean island. You know, people tend to forget this as well in the broad scheme of things, but it's very, very important to Florida. I'm very proud as a member of the bar, and just for the record, and the Hurricanes are over here, and the one Seminole is right here. So
we won't hold that against you.
Don't hold it against
That's
me.
right, we won't. Absolutely.
But the Florida bar represents thousands of people here in the state of Florida. And Florida is a very, very important state to the state of Cuba. So the fact that they were there beginning a conversation, it's a conversation. And we have a ways to go in regards to the policy for legal.
But what is the policy of the Obama administration? I mean, you got to call it what it is. It's still a terrorist state. By taking them off the list, it doesn't change the idea of their activities being, you know, harboring fugitives, bypassing international law by providing goods and military goods to North Korea. All of those things, repressing civil rights, all of those things are directly related to the Castro brothers regime. For anybody to think that's going to change while they're alive is just living in a fantasy world.
Let it be clear, Ed. The president wants freedom in Cuba like anyone else, on your side of the aisle and my side of the aisle. But certainly, the policy of the last 50 years, we know that it hasn't been working. We're trying something different here. Let's give it a chance. Let's see where it goes. Let's see what the Pope has to say when he comes to address Congress in September. And he visits Cuba as well, Michael.
Right. Yes.
And the conversation needs to continue here in South Florida.
Yeah. Andy, let me ask you, I don't know exactly how to characterize it, but I think that, that you and Cuba scholars and people from Venezuela know that the Cuban intelligence service has permeated the regime in Venezuela.
Correct.
They run many of these intelligence operations and cracking down on pro-democracy activists.
Correct.
Now, I don't know that that is a act of terrorism, but if Cuba is promising to be a good citizen of the world, how does that square with what they're doing in Venezuela?
That's a very good question, Michael. And you've seen not only has Cuba been destroyed by the totalitarian system of the Castro brothers, but with what they have done with Venezuela.
Right.
And the Venezuelans. And so I had the privilege, as you know, when I left Cuba 3 days before Bay of Pigs, to actually move to Venezuela when my father worked for Coca-Cola. It was a very wealthy country, a very flourishing country in Latin America. Today, economically, it's a disaster. Now, the issue of terrorism is very important here because, as you know, I had the privilege when President Obama was first selected to partake with diplomats and scholars at the Brookings Institution in preparing the next foreign policy towards Cuba. As a professor of international relations, diplomatic relations has its steps. And in order for, as a matter of fact, it was very interesting, the title of our report ended up Learning to Salsa. Learning to dance, you got to have two people on the floor knowing the steps. Right now, up to now, and I give a lot of credit to President Obama, because at least he is the first president, Democrat or Republican, but from an academic point of view, to try something, rather than coming to South Florida and saying, Viva Cuba Libre, and nothing happened, Republicans or Democrats. However, I always had my doubts whether Cuba was involved in terrorism or not. I needed to see facts. And it was a former student of mine that ended up working for the intelligence community that finally one day, I won't mention the name, that took me to lunch and showed me a file and says, you got 1 minute.
And what did you see?
I was convinced.
You saw activities.
So, is Cuba involved in terrorism? I think that's not the issue anymore. I think we need to, I agree with you, Marlon. I think we need to step back. Irregardless, change has taken place in Cuba, and it took place when Fidel Castro gave power over to his brother Raul. How can the United States now play a role in not only the Castro brothers, because I agree with you, but one of the mistakes that we have made, including the Cuban American community, in my humble opinion, was to put the people of Cuba along with the regime. Michael, out of the 11, if I may, Marlon, finish, of the 11 million people in Cuba today, 9 million were born after the revolution. This is all they've seen. How we change their way of thinking, to me, will be the greatest challenge.
And the key is, where's that change going to come from, right? Is it going to come from
within?
Political, within where? Within families? Within the people on the ground? Within culture? Within governments? Within the business
coming from
leaders?
the Cuban government. It's got to give from the Cuban
Well, that's
people.
the debate, Dr. Gomez. Where's this change going to come from?
It's got to, we have to somehow build bridges, additional bridges with the Cuban people and strengthen their concept of civil society.
And that is, I mean, that is the stated goal, December 17th. That is what President Obama said, is that our goal here is to help the Cuban people. My question, Ed, is that you can't really do an end run around the Castro government.
No, and ultimately what we're talking about here in the simplest terms is that the United States wants a prom date, and the prom date's not going to show up. She's a pretty girl, she's gorgeous, she has great opportunities, there's great possibilities.
But they're going to dance salsa, though.
They're not going to dance, but they're not going to dance with us until those Castro brothers are not there.
All right. Well,
we need the government to
one's
engage
84,
there.
the other is 88, and who knows how long they will last, although I got to say, Raul looks pretty good for a
However,
octogenarian.
there are two key issues here that we need to look forward.
Hold your thought, Andy. We have to take a break, and we'll come back with our roundtable discussion in just a minute. On this Sunday morning, live in our studio, a very robust discussion about Cuba. We're going to move on to the state legislature and other topics as well. But gentlemen, first I want to play some video of President Obama visiting the shrine of Our Lady of Charity, the Ermita de la Caridad. He did this on Thursday. It was unannounced. He had been out at the National Hurricane Center, and the president went to the Ermita, and he said that it was, or a spokesperson said, it was to show respect for the Cuban diaspora. And Andy, I know that some hardliners who are angered about the overtures to the Castro regime don't see this as a respectful act, but, you know, I think that it was genuine.
I completely agree with you. My good friend Fabiola Santiago from the Miami Herald had a wonderful column in yesterday's paper.
She did.
And I completely agree. I applaud President Obama's effort. I am very grateful for the President of the United States to have gone to the Ermita and show respect, not just to the old guard, but to all Cuban Americans in terms of what that church represents to us.
Yeah, I would agree. Ed, let me ask you about this. One of the other demands that Raul Castro has made of the United States for diplomatic relations, embassies, and so on, is that the United States return the Guantanamo Bay naval base. You know, my thought is, and thought of experts like Andy and others, is that, you know, even the prospect of the Russians moving into a deep water port 90 miles from our shores just it makes you kind of shiver.
It keeps me up at night in this respect, because we do have a president that seems to be, you know, commander of appeasement. I mean, with the most, you know, evil folks in the world, whether it's Iran or whether it's Cuba. We're talking about we need. Why not ask? If you're the Castro brothers, why not ask for a Gitmo? You might just get. You might just get.
He'll ask for it, but Marlon, come on.
You know, rather than be a commander of appeasement, he's really a commander of engagement, right? And this is what we have here. This is what is happening. That's really causing us all this emotion, right? Both politically and personally, even for persons like Jennifer, who was just here from the Florida bar. You know, really, Putin is really being isolated right now. You know, he has his issues, even with the U.S. Voting against his friends at FIFA. He is showing his true colors, right? Yeah. So he's going to do what he needs to do to self-preserve his power in his circle. Yeah. But we need to find the persons across the world and engage with other leaders, including in the Caribbean and Latin America, to find a space. We need political space, Michael. We need space to allow this change to happen. It's not going to happen overnight.
No, it's going to take several years. It's going to take time. If I may, I'm reminded of a famous quote from Senator Hayakawa of California years ago when they were debating the Panama Canal and whether we should return it to Panama. And he said, "It's ours. We stole it fair and square." I kind of think about Gitmo a little bit in that same regard, but I agree. I don't think that we're just going to give. There'll be some way to return that at some point, but not for a long time.
He needs to move down the menu and pick something else.
That's right. You know, I've had this conversation with our military leaders in the Pentagon, and it baffles my way of thinking when they tell me, well, it's outdated. That's not the issue.
No.
From a national security point, to me, that is the issue.
It's a strategic.
To see, Michael, to see a Russian spy ship the eve before the first meeting between the Americans and Cubans in Havana, That did not happen by mistake.
No, that was a symbolic.
That was a symbolic gesture.
Yes,
But let's understand, this has been a one-sided negotiation. We open up diplomatic
That we can
relations.
see,
What
Ed,
did,
that we
but
can
what
see.
did we get in return?
That
Did
we
we
can
get better
see.
behavior out of the Cuban government? No. Did we get anything out of the Cuban government? No. We got nothing.
But we should not give up, Ed. We should not give up. Yeah, I completely agree with you, but we should not give up. Again, after 56 years, something changed. We got to try something different.
But let's not play the fool.
All right,
Let's
let's hope we're not playing the fool.
I hope not.
All right, before we run out of time, we simply must talk about the fact that tomorrow the Florida legislature goes back to work. They have until June 30th.
Same time as hurricane season. Wow, interesting.
Very symbolic.
And that's symbolic too. And Marlon, what strikes me is that normally with the special session, they line it up very carefully and they know what's going to happen and they just sort of go through the numbers and make it happen. And there is no real agreement there.
Well, hopefully with the time off that they had some political space to kind of have some discussions behind the scenes. Some things we see, Ed, and some things we don't,
right.
In regards to discussions. And hopefully, I'm hoping the governor will step into that political space to provide greater leadership to allow both
Ed,
sides
how
to
can he step into that political space and be a neutral arbitrator when he's already come down on the side of the House?
He can't, and with all due respect to the governor, it's not his role. The budget is a legislative function, and you have democracy in action. As messy as it is, democracy in action with differing opinions is going to get the right result. Already, the federal government, as we know, last week or two, the federal government is putting up about $1 billion, just shy of $1 billion of LIP monies. It's important to know what the concern was of Florida. One of the concerns of Florida was that LIP goes directly to the providers and it serves a certain set of population.
Right. The safety net hospitals.
But the Medicaid expansion piece served a slightly different set of people, and the discussion was who was going to drop off, who was not going to be served if we moved to this Medicaid expansion. It wasn't just about politics, it was also about actual policy.
No, it is about policy, and the Senate tried to address that with a compromise so that people didn't have to go to Medicaid first, they could go right to the insurance exchange, but the governor said, hey, that's not acceptable to me either.
We hope there's more movement because there are a lot of people waiting for access to
800,000 or more.
One thing's for certain, by June 30th, we'll have a budget.
But we hope so.
And it'll be $1 billion contributed by the federal government that wasn't there before the special session.
I hope you're right. Okay, I've got to stop you all. As much fun as this has been, and I want to thank you for coming in.
My
Andy,
pleasure.
great to see you. Ed and Marlon, come back again. All right, U.S. and Cuba historic change, legislature special session, fight over state Medicaid. You know, all kinds of things we have talked about, but up next we're going to talk about revelations about 2 Miami Beach cops. Local 10 News has obtained new documents, and they have some startling revelations about 2 Miami Beach police officers accused of very bad behavior on the job. It includes racist language and pornographic images. Alex Carullo is the only Miami Beach cop so far fired over the scandal surrounding these emails. Hatzovella, I believe, has the report now from our newsroom.
In this termination document, we learned Lieutenant Alex Carullo was facing 13 internal affairs charges when he was fired, most of them related to, quote, conduct unbecoming an employee of the city, which the document calls disgraceful. They cite 138 alleged instances of improper use of city email and confidential material. A significant number of messages were, quote, graphically sexual, racially insensitive, homophobic, misogynistic, or confidential in nature. On the list, porn videos, inappropriate pictures of people, including women in demeaning situations, pictures and texts referring to African Americans as the N-word, or to homosexuals using the F-word. Carullo is also accused of engaging in a highly inappropriate and descriptive conversation about a victim of an alleged sexual battery case with a Hialeah police detective. Investigators say they also found Carullo had used his work email to close an account with a pornographic website. It was last July when Chief Dan Oates decided to look into the issue and started a formal internal affairs investigation. Knowing what he knew at that point, the chief demoted Carullo from captain back to lieutenant. The other officer involved is the now retired Major Angel Vasquez, who on paper has a stellar police career until he was forced to retire last summer.
At the time that I asked him to relieve immediately, I thought this was about pornography.
It was about porn, racist jokes, and on one occasion, an autopsy photo allegedly transmitted from Vasquez's department email.
I would have demoted him and moved forward with the criminal and internal affairs investigation.
Vasquez's violations included giving a lift to a woman in a patrol car and the appearance of meddling in a family member's DUI.
That was Hansel Villa reporting. Hansel, thanks. All right, personnel jackets for both men say they have completed ethics training about the same time that they were sending these emails in 2012. Vasquez has declined to comment about all of this, but the state attorney's office is still looking into whether they're going to charge him criminally for making public an autopsy photo. We reached out to Carullo's attorney. We have not heard back. All right, still to come, my personal perspective about Cuba getting off the list of countries that deal in terrorism. Here is a live picture from our Key West cam. Looks pretty great down there in Cayo Hueso. And here is Trent Eric with the forecast.
Hello, South Florida. I'm meteorologist Trent Eric. Later on this afternoon, right around 3, 4 o'clock, we should see our temperatures climb up to 88, 89 degrees. That's exactly where we should be for this time of year. Now, our rain chance today, right around 30%. We've seen scattered showers and a couple of small thunderstorms on and off throughout the morning and afternoon. That rain chance is only going to go up over the next couple of days. But this weekend, our weather pattern really dominated by this east-southeast wind. It's been kicking up some stray showers and keeping things warm and humid here across South Florida. Let's look at that rain chance for the upcoming week. 30% for tomorrow. It'll keep going up to a 60 to 50% chance. Could start as early as Tuesday night, but it looks like really the afternoon, Wednesday and Thursday, will be the highlight, as we'll see widespread rainfall and also a significant chance at strong, if not severe, thunderstorms here across South Florida. So as we go through the next 3 days, start a hurricane season tomorrow. And again, there's that bump up in rain chance, 85 degrees. We'll be back tonight at 6 and 11 with more information in your forecast.
All right, Trent, thank you very much. Before we leave you this morning, a personal perspective about normalizing relations with Cuba. Like it or not, that is happening at a faster pace than anyone could have predicted. I personally didn't think there would be an opening between our two countries until after the Castro brothers were dead, but President Obama got tired of waiting and said, hey, let's just do this. It'll be my legacy, the way that Nixon opened relations with China. Problem is, Mr. Obama is giving Cuba basically everything they want and getting nothing in return. Human rights reform, forget about it. Free press, Release political prisoners, no way. Stop harassing dissidents, no. In Cuba, they've stepped it up. Raul Castro will now work on other demands like giving back Gitmo, which is entirely untenable, and paying Cuba billions of dollars for economic damage caused by the U.S. embargo. Well, good luck with that. Cuba already owes U.S. claimants billions for the private property that was seized after Fidel took power. Despite all this, the U.S. has taken Cuba off the list of countries involved in terrorism. The criteria to do so was extremely narrow. Had Cuba done anything really bad internationally in the last 6 months? Apparently not. And they promised to be good in the future. Well, that was good enough for Mr. Obama. But what about all those Cuban intelligence agents that have flooded Venezuela and are said to be running state security there? That is on the cusp of terrorism, isn't it? Or how about the freighter that was caught in Panama in 2013 with all kinds of Cuban weapons on board and dismantled MiG jets? All of it was headed for North Korea, a really bad actor. All this evidence taken together tells me Cuba has not earned the right to get off that bad boy list, but it has. Now come the diplomatic relations and exchange of ambassadors, and after that, the fight will come over lifting our embargo. But until Havana makes some serious concessions on basic human rights, the embargo, I think, should stay in place. That is my perspective for this week. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Remember, stay informed, get involved. We'll see you next week.